Hi guys, I'm back. I'm going to read chapter 2 of our book, What is the Declaration of Independence? Hope you enjoyed yesterday and continue to hear some more things of what we talked about from the beginning of the year as we review some more information for social studies. So chapter 2, Taxes and More Taxes. Besides taxing colonists, King George did other things that made the situation in America grow even more tense. In 1761, he ordered a renewal of the writs of assistance, which were a kind of search warrant. British customs officers and soldiers were allowed to search the shops, warehouses, and even people's homes. This was to make sure colonists were only buying things made in Great Britain or by the British. If goods from other countries were found, the shopkeeper or homeowner had to pay a fine to the king. So remember we talked about yesterday that the king was trying to make more money and have the colonists pay for the French and Indian War that he fought to get more land in the colonies. And this was one of the ways he was trying to get that money, by making them buy only items that were made in Great Britain. And I'm sure you would guess that the colonists were not happy with this. The colonists were furious. It was one thing to search a warehouse or even a shop, but searching people's homes was an outrage. Can you imagine someone coming into your house to look at everything you have? We talked about in the beginning of the year our first 10 amendments, which we call the Bill of Rights, and how we have the right to have a search warrant present if they're going to come into our house. This is where that came from, because this is one of the things they were living with when they were under the rule of King George and Great Britain. James Otis, a lawyer from Massachusetts, went to court. He tried to get the searches stopped. He is often credited with one of the most important lines in American history. Taxation without representation is tyranny. This idea that it's completely wrong to tax people without letting them have a voice in the matter would become a rallying cry for the American colonists. So they had no one representing them in Parliament over in Great Britain, but yet they were making all these rules and laws that they had to pay more money for certain items. But King George III didn't seem to care what the colonists thought. He needed more and more money, so Great Britain's Parliament passed more and more taxes on the colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764 hit the colonies hard. It was a tax on all sugar, molasses, wine, rum, and even some lumber and iron. Every home in the colonies used sugar every single day. A picture of the things they were taxing. The sugar tax hurt the economy of the colonies. Rum was big business in the colonies as it was used to trade for African slaves. Lumber and iron were important businesses too, and they were heavily taxed now. But Great Britain couldn't care less. It wanted as much money as it could get out of the colonists. And there's a map here I'm going to show you, showing where all the different trades were coming from in the different countries that were involved. Sorry, it's kind of hard holding the camera and reading the book at the same time. Later this same year, Parliament passed the Currency Act. Before this, the American colonies printed their own money. It was used to buy everyday goods. The Currency Act forced Americans to use British money. This angered the colonists because their colonial money was now worthless. People in the colonies took to the streets to protest against the king and Parliament. But this was only the beginning. Can you believe it gets worse? And here's a picture of how they were protesting and how they were so upset. And they would go into the streets to show that they were upset and angry. The Stamp Act of 1765 was like an explosion in the American colonies. Up until the Stamp Act, Americans mostly paid taxes to Great Britain on items sold to other countries. For example, if a merchant in Pennsylvania sold lumber to a Spanish company, The Pennsylvania Company had to pay Great Britain a tax on that sale. But any lumber that the Pennsylvania merchants sold to other colonial customers was not taxed. But with the Stamp Act, colonists paid a tax on items sold in America. For instance, anything printed on paper, newspaper, contracts, wills, even playing cards, had to have a British stamp, and there was a price for the stamp. If a newspaper cost 1 pence before the Stamp Act, afterward it cost 2 pence. The Stamp Act affected every colonist, and all of them hated it. Riots broke out across the colonies. In Boston, a man named Samuel Adams urged colonists to fight back. So what they're saying is that before the Stamp Act, they only had to pay if they sold to other countries. Now, once they created the Stamp Act, they had to practically double the price they were paying in order to put this stamp on all of the materials they were selling. First, they stormed the office of the British Tax Commissioner. The commissioner collected all the taxes for Great Britain. Then, protesters went to his home. He was so frightened by the crowd that he quit his job the very next day. In New York, 2,000 angry colonists ransacked the house of British Mayor Thomas James. Why? He boasted that he would ram the stamp tax down colonists' throats at the point of a sword. It was only after colonists stopped buying British goods that Parliament ended the Stamp Act. The plan had backfired. Did that put an end to the trouble? No. King George and Parliament came up with a new tax scheme. It was called the Townshend Acts. These 1767 acts taxed all colonial paint, oil, and glass. And one other thing, tea. Again, people in the colonies rebelled. They protested in the streets and they boycotted, meaning they refused to buy British goods. There's another picture here to show you some of these mobs and how they scared away some of the tax collectors and how angry they really were about all of these things that were happening to the colonists at this time. With the tax on glass, paper, and sugar in 1770. In fact, they got rid of almost everything in the Townshend Act. Only one tax was left in place, the tax on tea. Surely the colonists... I skipped a page there, guys. I did. Sorry. This was hard on many households. Only the British could sold certain things that most colonial families depended on. It was not easy to give these things up. What colonists minded the most was doing without tea. And I know to you guys that probably sounds funny, but they're going to talk a little bit about how important tea was to the colonists at that time. Tea was a favorite drink in the colonies. Even though it was expensive, most colonists were regular tea drinkers. Boiling water was a common way to purify water. So in every cup of tea, colonists were drinking both clean water and a delicious tasting beverage. We talked about how a lot of places don't have clean water. So back then, this was one way they can guarantee that they were getting some clean water. Most tea came to America on British ships that had first picked it up in other parts of the world. Now colonists found ways to get tea illegally. Some tea was shipped in from other countries without the British authorities ever finding out. Some tea was grown in America, including teas made of mint or chicory. The colonists agreed to tough it out and continue the boycott. It was important to make the king and Parliament understand how fed up they were over these taxes. Eventually, the boycott was a success, or mostly a success. Once again, Great Britain was losing too much money, so Parliament did away with the taxation on glass, paper, and sugar in 1770. In fact, they got rid of almost everything in the Townshend Acts. Only one tax was left in place, the tax on tea. Surely the colonists would see how reasonable the king and the British government were being. So here's a little extra on the tea in the colonies. The tradition of drinking tea came across the Atlantic Ocean with the first British settlers of the New World. Tea became popular throughout the colonies. Big cities like New York and Philadelphia had many tea gardens where tea was served in the finest porcelain or sometimes in silver cups. Even in tiny rural towns, American colonists enjoyed drinking tea. If you drank tea, whether in a fancy tea garden or at your kitchen table, it was a sign that you were doing well and you were rather sophisticated. So it made people think that you were wealthy and you had kind of a fancy drink, and it was a nice way to spend their days. So that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Go underneath now on the class assignments. You're going to see that there's a form there for you to answer just a couple questions. Tell me something you learned, and then 2 short multiple choice questions. And I will begin reading chapter 3 in a little bit. Have a great day, guys. Miss you.